I wrote a Twilight Zone-inspired story, and it came true. They say every writer puts a piece of themselves into their work. A sliver of their soul, a fragment of their past, a shadow of their fears. I just never realized my own horror would be the thing to come crawling out of the page. I didn't write a story that came true. I wrote a truth that became a story. And in doing so, I wrote myself out of existence. It all started 3 months ago. Back then, I thought it was the beginning of my life, not the end of it. Welcome to Sleepy Echoes Unwind, where the night remembers old stories. Tonight, we journey into a place where shadows linger and forgotten whispers rise with the dark. Now, light your lanterns, slow your breathing, and let us drift together into the hush of the night. My name is Arthur Penwright, and for 15 years, that name meant nothing. It was just a name typed at the top of manuscripts that always came back with coffee-stained rejection slips. A name on a mailbox for a house that felt more like the bank's than mine. A name I'd whisper to myself in the dark. A desperate mantra against the crushing weight of failure. I called myself a writer, but really, I was just a man who wrote, and there's a difference. A writer gets published, a writer gets read. A man who writes just bleeds ink onto paper in a quiet room, creating worlds no one will ever see. My days were a monotonous loop of staring at a blank screen, the cursor blinking like a mocking eye. I'd fill pages with words that felt hollow and characters that moved like puppets with their strings cut. Then I'd walk to the mailbox, my heart a nervous bird in my chest, and find another manila envelope. Thank you for your submission, but while we enjoyed the premise, it's not the right fit. We wish you the best of luck. Each one was a polite, paper-thin nail in the coffin of my ambition. My house was a lot like my career, full of potential but slowly falling apart. It was a small 2-story place on a street where all the other houses had fresh paint and manicured lawns. Mine had peeling paint and the lawn that was more weed than grass. It had good bones, people said, but the soul was weary. And its deepest, darkest corner was the basement. I hated that basement. It was an unfinished, damp space with stone walls that always seemed to weep and a cracked concrete floor that looked like a shattered map. A single, bare bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting a sickly yellow light that created more shadows than it chased away. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, cold earth, and something else. Something that felt ancient. Like the smell of a book left unopened for a century. I only ever went down there for laundry or to reset the wheezing circuit breaker. Every time I felt a profound unease, like I was an intruder in my own home. I'd do what I had to, my eyes darting into the dark corners, and then I'd take the wooden stairs 2 at a time, fumbling for the light switch before pulling the door shut, always a little too fast. I'd lock the bolt, not just close it. A stupid, superstitious ritual, but it made me feel a little safer. I was on the brink, not just financially, but spiritually. The dream I'd chased since I was a boy had led me to a dead end. I was ready to give it all up, to pack away the laptop, get a real job, and let Arthur Penwright, the writer, die. That was the night the story came. It wasn't like inspiration. It was like a fever. It hit me suddenly, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I was at my desk, staring at another half-finished failure, when a sentence appeared in my mind, fully formed and chilling. The house did not know it had a secret. My fingers flew to the keyboard. I didn't think, I didn't plan, I just transcribed. The story poured out of me, a torrent of words I didn't know I had. It was the story of a man, a lonely, forgotten man, a lot like me, who lives in a house with a damp, unsettling basement. One day, driven by a sound he can't place, he finds something impossible. Behind a stack of old boxes in the deepest, darkest corner, he finds a door. It wasn't a normal door. It was made of a dark, petrified wood, covered in intricate, spiraling carvings that seemed to shift when you weren't looking right at them. There was no handle, just a tarnished iron lock in the shape of a closed eye. The man in the story becomes obsessed. He tries to pry it open, to break it down, but the wood is like iron. The story was called The Door in the Dust. I described the world on the other side, a place the man could only see through the keyhole, a world of silent, gray geometry, a landscape of impossible angles and cold, featureless structures under a sky the color of static. No people, no animals, no life. Just the oppressive, suffocating silence. And there was the Guardian. The thing that paced on the other side. I called it the Lankerman. I described it in visceral detail, though I had no idea where the image came from. It was unnaturally tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, moving with a disjointed, insect-like grace. Its skin was the color of ash, stretched tight over its bones. But its face was the real horror. A smooth, unbroken oval of what looked like white porcelain. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. A perfect, terrifying blank. I wrote for hours. The sun came up and I barely noticed. When I finally typed the last word, I felt hollowed out, exhausted, like I'd run a marathon in my mind. The final sentence was, the man, having finally broken the lock, being pulled through the doorway by the Lankerman, his scream swallowed by the silent, gray world. I read it back, and the shiver went through me. It was good. Better than good. It was terrifying. It felt real. Too real. Shaking my head to clear the strange feeling, I did what I always did. I found the email for a high-concept horror publisher that had rejected me 3 times, attached the file, and hit send. I didn't expect a reply. I just needed it out of my house. A week later, my phone rang. It was the publisher. They didn't just like it, they loved it. They wanted to buy it, not for an anthology, but as a standalone novella. They were talking about a significant advance, about marketing pushes and bestseller potential. I sat on my worn-out couch with the phone pressed to my ear, and I cried. For the first time in years, the silence in my house was filled with the sound of joy. The Door in the Dust didn't just sell, it exploded. It was a word-of-mouth phenomenon. People called it the scariest story they'd ever read. It climbed the bestseller lists. My name, Arthur Penwright, was suddenly everywhere. Interviews, photo shoots, talk shows. I was no longer the man who writes. I was the writer. The money poured in. I paid off the house. I bought a new car. I was living the dream I had almost given up on. But even with all the celebration, something felt off. It started with a sound. A faint scratching. It came from the basement. I'd be in the kitchen making coffee in my fancy new machine, and I'd hear it. A dry, skittering sound. I told myself it was the house settling, or rats, a problem for an exterminator, a problem money could fix. I made a mental note to call someone, and then promptly forgot when my agent called with more good news. Then other things started. Small things. I'd come home from an interview to find a book on my shelf pulled out an inch, like someone had thought about reading it and changed their mind. A dining chair would be angled slightly away from the table. The keys I always left in a bowl by the door would be on the counter instead. It was nothing, my mind playing tricks on me. I was busy, exhausted. My routine was shot. It was easy to be forgetful, to misremember. But the feeling of unease, that same feeling I used to get in the basement, started to bleed into the rest of the house. I'd be sitting in my office, sun streaming through the window, and I'd feel a sudden, intense chill, the hairs on my arms standing on end, the distinct, unshakable sensation of being watched. The scratching from the basement got bolder. It wasn't a skittering anymore. It was a deliberate, rhythmic scrape. 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 Scrape, like long fingernails dragging slowly down a wooden plank. But there were no wooden planks down there, just stone and concrete. One night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound was a physical presence in the house, an itch under my skin. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight I'd bought for emergencies and opened the basement door. The familiar smell of damp earth washed over me, stronger than I ever remembered. I flicked the switch. The single bulb flickered violently, then held, casting its weak yellow light over the space. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and foolish. The scratching stopped. The silence that rushed in was somehow worse. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, dancing over old furniture draped in sheets, stacks of yellowing newspapers, and cobwebs as thick as cotton. Everything was still, nothing out of place. And yet, the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. I did a full sweep, my heart hammering my ribs. I found nothing. No rats, no signs of a break-in. Just the cold, the damp, and the silence. I backed up the stairs, never turning away from the dark, and pulled the door shut, locking the bolt with a trembling hand. That night, the nightmares started. They were always the same. I was in the world from my story, the silent, gray world of impossible geometry. I'd be standing on a vast, featureless plain under a sky of television static. In the distance, I could see the Lankerman. It never moved toward me. It just stood there, its blank porcelain face turned in my direction, watching. I always woke up with my sheets soaked in sweat. The image of that featureless face burned into the back of my eyelids. A week later, the circuit breaker tripped. With a groan of utter dread, I knew I had to go back down. I took the flashlight again, my hand slick with sweat. I opened the door, flicked the useless switch, and went down into the dark. The breaker box was in the far corner, behind the ancient, hulking water heater. I squeezed past the heater, the cold metal pressing against my back. I reset the breaker, and as I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something on the concrete wall. An etching. A carving in the stone I'd never seen before. My blood ran cold. It was a spiral, a complex, looping sigil. It was the exact same sigil I had described in my story, the one the protagonist finds carved into the wall next to the hidden door. I just stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. It was a detail I made up, a piece of fictional flair to add atmosphere. It had no business being here, etched into the foundation of my house. I reached out a shaking finger and touched it. The stone was cold, and the grooves of the carving were deep and worn, as if they had been there for a very, very long time. Panic set in, a real, clawing, all-consuming panic. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. This was real. I ran upstairs and tore my office apart, looking for my original manuscript. I found the printed-out draft, my frantic edits scrawled in the margins. I sat there, under the bright light of my success, and read the story over and over, my hands shaking. Was there something I'd missed? A clue? A memory? Had I seen this sigil before, years ago, and forgotten about it, only for it to surface from my subconscious? I spent the next 2 days in a research frenzy. I dug into the history of my house, the town. I spent hours in the local library archives, poring over old maps and property deeds, looking for anything strange. A mysterious death, a missing person, a local legend, anything. There was nothing. My house was built in the 1950s. It belonged to one family, the Millers, before me. A perfectly normal, boring family who sold the house and moved to Florida to retire. No horror, no mystery. My agent, Sarah, called. "Arthur, you okay? You missed the call with the German publishers." I tried to explain. "Sarah, something is happening in my house. My story, I think it's coming true." There was a long pause. "Arthur," she said, her voice laced with careful, measured concern. "You've been under a lot of pressure. This kind of success, it can be disorienting. Maybe you should take that vacation we talked about." They thought I was losing my mind. The classic artist, driven mad by his own creation. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. I was living out a horror trope, and nobody believed me. The ambiguity was gone. I knew I wasn't crazy, but I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. That night, the sound from the basement changed again. The scratching was gone. Now it was a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap. 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 It was a delicate, patient sound, like a single long finger tapping against a wooden door. But there was no wooden door in my basement. For a full day, the tapping was incessant, a constant, maddening beat that echoed through the floorboards, a sound no one but me could hear. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I just sat in my living room, listening to the impossible sound, feeling my sanity fray with every tap. Finally, something inside me broke. I couldn't live like this. I couldn't live with the fear and the uncertainty. I had to face it. Whatever was down there, whatever I had written into existence, I had to see it. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a solid steel tire iron from the trunk of my car. It felt pathetic in my hand, but it was better than nothing. I walked to the basement door and took a deep breath. The tapping continued its steady, patient rhythm. I opened the door. The single bulb at the bottom of the stairs was out. The darkness was absolute, a solid wall of black. It was like staring into a grave. I switched on my flashlight, its powerful beam seeming weak against the oppressive gloom. Tap. 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 I went down the stairs, each creak of the wood a gunshot in the silence. The air was frigid, stealing the breath from my lungs. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, as I reached the concrete floor. It was coming from the back wall, the wall with the sigil. I followed the sound, my flashlight beam trembling, cutting a frantic path through the darkness. Past the sheet-covered ghosts of old furniture, past the water heater, to the far, damp stone wall. And then I saw it. My heart stopped. My breath hitched in my throat. Where there had only ever been a wall of solid concrete and stone, there was now a door. It was exactly as I had described it. A dark door of petrified wood, covered in carvings that seemed to writhe at the edge of my vision. The iron lock, shaped like a closed eye, was there, only now it was broken, hanging open like a screaming mouth. The tapping was coming from the other side. As I watched, frozen in pure, primal terror, the sound stopped. A deep, groaning creak echoed in the small space as the door began to swing inward, opening on its own. It revealed a sliver of darkness unlike any I had ever seen. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was an active, hungry void that seemed to drink my flashlight beam, to pull the warmth from the air. And then a hand emerged. It was gray and long, with fingers like desiccated twigs tipped with black, needle-like nails. It reached out of the void, planting itself on the doorframe. The skin was stretched so tight I could see the shape of the bones beneath. Then, the rest of it followed, unfolding itself from the doorway with an unnatural, fluid motion that broke all the rules of biology. It was tall. So tall, its head nearly brushed the ceiling joists. Its limbs were impossibly long and spindly. It was a stick figure drawn by a madman. It stepped fully into the basement, into my flashlight beam, and I finally saw its face. A perfect, smooth oval of white porcelain. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank, featureless void. The Lankerman. The monster from my story. It was here. It was real. And it was standing 10 feet away from me. The tire iron fell from my hand and clattered to the floor. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare into that blank, horrifying face and wait for the end. But the end didn't come. Not like I expected. The creature didn't lunge. It just stood there, its blank face tilted slightly, as if studying me with senses I couldn't comprehend. And that's when I heard it. A sound from upstairs. Footsteps. The familiar creak of the floorboards in the hallway above. The phone began to ring, and I heard the footsteps hurry to answer it. Then I heard a voice. My voice.
Sarah! Hey! Yeah, everything's great! No, just working on some new ideas. The success? It's been a whirlwind, but I'm handling it.
The voice was happy, carefree, confident. The voice of Arthur Penwright, the best-selling author. It was my voice, but it wasn't me. A cold dread, sharper and deeper than fear, bloomed in my chest. What was happening? I looked back at the Lankerman. Its blank face was still fixed on me, and in that silent, terrifying gaze, a new, monstrous thought began to form. That night of writing, the fever, the words pouring out of me. It wasn't inspiration, it was reception. I hadn't been a creator. I had been a receiver, a cosmic secretary taking dictation from a predator. My blood ran cold. The story wasn't a product of my imagination. It was a blueprint, a recipe, and it needed one final secret ingredient: belief. My belief, my publisher's belief, the belief of millions of readers who made my nightmare a bestseller. I hadn't written a door into existence. I had been tricked into opening one that was already there. The creature upstairs, the man living my life, enjoying my success. That was it. The first one, the true Lankerman. It had whispered its story into the mind of a desperate writer, and when that writer made the story real, it stepped out of the fiction and into the author's life. It wasn't a doppelganger. It was a replacement. I looked at the thing in front of me, this second creature, and I finally understood. It wasn't here to drag me into its gray world. The door was open now. They could come and go as they pleased. This one wasn't a jailer. It was a successor, an echo, another copy ready to be pasted over the source code of reality. The Lankerman in the basement slowly raised a long, skeletal hand, not to me, to its own face. It touched the smooth, white porcelain. A faint cracking sound, like ice breaking on a frozen lake, echoed in the silence. The cracks spread, a web of black lines across the blankness. Then, the mask shattered, falling away in pieces that turned to dust before they hit the floor. There was no face underneath, no skull, no muscle, just a swirling vortex of television static, a formless, hungry void in the shape of a head, and it was reaching for me. My scream died in my throat. I wasn't being attacked. I was being scanned, copied. The thing upstairs had taken my life, my name. This new one just needed my face. I was the template, the original draft, about to be deleted. I didn't write a story that came true. I was just a fool who picked up a phone call from a monster that thanked me by stealing my name, then my life. And now, as its cold, static-filled fingers touched my skin, it was stealing myself. The story was over. I was becoming the blank page. What if the stories we write aren't just fiction? What if they're echoes of other lives we've lived, other places we've been? If you want to explore more stories that blur that thin, terrifying line, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. It helps the channel more than you know. And let me know in the comments, if you could write yourself into a new life, what would you do with the character you left behind?